Hello and welcome to our gathering today on Inequality, Exaggerated. I'd like to talk to you about inequality in the time of COVID and what perhaps your expectations are about the future and what the surrounding political narratives have been around the topic of inequality more widely. So if we think about COVID and we think about inequality, some of these ideas might already flash up to you. What do you see in these headlines and what are your impressions of them? They've been taken from a wide range of sources. So we've got some American newspapers here. We've got some from the left wing and some from the right wing. They are all broadsheet newspapers, but there is a caveat here. All newspapers have bias. And all newspapers are writing for a specific audience in mind, and they are writing to persuade you. So you should question everything you read in a newspaper. But what we're seeing here really is the picture that inequality exists everywhere, and the coronavirus crisis has actually exposed a lot of this inequality. So if we look at the top one, Equality's watchdog to launch a probe into entrenched racial inequalities laid bare by the pandemic. Entrenched racial inequalities, so this is the idea that some races are experiencing more inequality than others, and the virus and the very kind of nature of the virus itself, but also the systems that are occurring now since lockdown has started, that's exposed a lot of what we call entrenched inequalities. These are inequalities that are kind of built into our very political system and way of living. The New York Times article, Black Americans are hit harder by the coronavirus. So, of course, this is referring to the fact that the virus ostensibly kind of factually, if you like, and statistically shows that certain ethnic groups are catching the virus more than others. So Black Americans being one example cited here. But I want you to think about that carefully because, yes, statistically, certain races are hit harder by the virus, but we need to think why. Why would a certain group of people, whether it's gender, whether it's age, whether it's ethnicity, race, why are that group being hit harder by the virus? And we need to be thinking about how our medical system looks after these groups of people. We need to look at things like the political system and whether we are biased in our very politics. And if you know what's going on with Trump in America at the minute, and if you know about the fact that in America they don't have the same idea of a welfare state that we have here, you'll know that a particularly at-risk group in terms of welfare and health are Black Americans anyway. So there isn't really a wonder that Black Americans are coming out as hit harder by the virus statistically. And if you look a little bit further down, this is called systemic inequality. So again, we've got the idea of entrenched systemic inequality. We also know, though, that the pandemic has had a bit of a damaging effect on women as well. And this, if you search this on Google, you can see so many articles from different newspapers. There's quite a lot in The Guardian about how women's rights have kind of gone back decades. The gender pay gap is widening. Women are taking on much more of the domestic role than perhaps they would have given away because of nurseries and school provision. But now if they're working from home, they're having to juggle everything. And there's some really interesting studies here that you can read up on about how I think it was something like 75% of fathers believe they are doing an equal amount of housework and domestic roles and childcare as women, and women think that only 5%. According to women, only 5% of men are doing that. So there's some interesting statistics on that if you wanted to read that up further. But yeah, there's all sorts of other things as well, like the class idea and how the working class have been hit much harder by the virus. Certain classes of people, they have different types of jobs. So you'd be much more likely to be a key worker, for example, if you're in a kind of working class role, and you'd be much more likely to have less PPE provision, so less safety provision as well. And so this is all building into this idea of entrenched systemic inequality, and certain groups of people are just not being looked after at the minute. So if we look at some other statistics here, I thought this was quite interesting to look at the idea of deprivation. Now, deprivation is the kind of measure of how much poverty we have, or how much kind of opportunity do you have, how much wealth do you have. But there's something called the index of multiple deprivation, and that's here. And we can see from this graph that there are more deaths in this cohort of people. Okay, so if you are more deprived, so if you have less wealth, less opportunity, you are more likely to die of coronavirus. I would really like you to think about why that is the case. So why are people who have less money more likely to die from coronavirus? There'd be all sorts of things that will be coming to your mind from that. Potentially, you know, they have much less provision, so they'll have to be going out to shops more, they'll have to be going to shops every day, for example. I have a deprived relative who has 4 children, and she has to go to the shops every few days, rather than she can't afford to do a big weekly shop, she can't afford to do you know, a massive delivery all at once. The less deprived in our country will be able to order a lot more things online. So we need to be thinking about the examples and the scenarios in which the more deprived are losing out continually because of coronavirus. I thought this was interesting from a schooling perspective. So what kinds of parents are choosing to send their child back to school, and the things that I've highlighted here in quintile 1, the yellow bit here and here. This is primary, this is secondary. In the quintile 1, which is the poorest of our communities, their parents are much less likely to send their child back to school. So not only are the more deprived dying more easily of coronavirus, but their children are much less likely to be educated as well. So all of this shows not only does COVID reveal and lockdown reveal that inequality exists, but actually inequality is getting much worse as well, and that's what's going on here in this professor's quote here, Dan Nichols. Look him up on Twitter if you can. He says the impact of the present pandemic will not be felt equally. Our asymmetric society will become more so. Asymmetric means unbalanced, so like this graph shows here and this graph shows here, that's asymmetry. They're not the same. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the background on that and where it comes from. So there's an awful lot to read here, and I'm not going to read all of these articles out to you, but I would urge you to have a little read of them yourselves. What we've got here, I'm going to look at gender, then I'm going to look at class, and then I'm going to look at race and how inequalities are emerging and worsening. So here, a very interesting article about women's rights, women's participation in the workforce, and how that's been sort of set back decades because of the crisis and because of lockdown. This particular writer talks about women bearing the brunt of extra childcare and housework. They're actually, statistically, women are losing jobs in greater numbers as well. But also there are more systemic things, so things at the heart of organisation. There are fewer women in politics, fewer voices at the heart of government. These are all things that we need to be thinking about. Are female voices, are working class voices, are black voices being heard? Are they being heard? So the article does continue, and it talks about mothers being more likely to have permanently lost their job by 47%, and 14% were more likely to have been furloughed, which means that your job's kind of on pause, and you're getting a bit of money from the government to keep you going. So women are actually being kind of forced out of the workforce essentially because of COVID. And then not only that, but this intersects with class as well. So the problem worsens when you look at the working class as well as with the women problem. Only 1 in 10 lower earners are able to work from home, and 69% of low earners are women. So what you're saying here is that women are much more likely to lose their job, and the ones that are working are more at risk because they can't work from home. So this is why we're building that picture of inequality. And these are just things that you might want to consider when you're thinking about inequality and the pandemic. Domestic inequality, economic inequality, or workforce inequality. You might have heard of the gender pay gap. If you haven't, you absolutely have to read up on that, men and women. Political inequality, motherhood, and low earners, so the gender and the class intersection, so how those inequalities kind of worsen when both of those codes are applied. When we look at class, this is an absolutely fascinating article. Robert Reich talks about, he actually creates different names and labels for different people in society based on their class, and he diagnoses what experience of inequality they have had during lockdown. So he comes up with these labels. So one of the groups he talks about are the remotes. So these are actually they're in a pretty good position. These are your professionals, possibly managerial, about 35% of the workforce. They are doing a lot of work from home. They're using technology. They're getting the exact same pay. They're, of course, a bit anxious about the crisis, but they're very well off. But then the picture starts to darken a little bit. So then you've got the essentials. Now, many of us will have these people in our households or our families. Essentials are about 30% of the workforce. These are your nurses, your childcare workers, food processors, truck drivers, transit workers, sanitation workers, police officers, firefighters, military, anybody who's offering kind of an essential service to the country. And whilst these people are obviously still getting paid, they're experiencing a huge amount of risk at work. Some better than others, but you might have seen a lot on the news about nursing home workers not having enough PPE. They actually managed to source that quite late. Doctors and nurses not having effective PPE equipment. PPE equipment is your kind of face masks and your hand gel and your screens, things that you'll be seeing around school. But these people might not necessarily be experiencing the safety measures that they should be. And according to Robert Reich, they deserve hazard pay. You've then got the unpaid staff. So we don't just mean the unemployed here. We mean those people who've lost their jobs during the crisis, but we also mean people who have been furloughed. Essentially, they are still classed as unpaid. And we're also talking about people who are self-employed, whose business might have to be put on hold. Of course, these are personal services that can't be done remotely, but these people are losing out, and not all of them have been given kind of money from the government to help them. So again, we're seeing little patches of inequality kind of cropping up because of the crisis. And according to Reich here, he says, so far, the government has failed this class of people, the unpaid. Apparently, the checks that have been mailed out are, he thinks, a pittance, which is a really low amount of money, and loans to small businesses have actually not been happening as much as they should have done. In fact, very big, already very wealthy, very well-connected businesses, according to Reich, have experienced much more support from the government. And then this is the most worrying group. This is the group that he calls the forgotten. So this is everyone for whom social distancing is impossible. Now, we're talking prisons, we're talking reservations, migrant farm workers, homeless shelters, nursing homes, people that the government has kind of written off, I suppose. And I think that the situation here is much worse in America because of their, much less stringent welfare state. But what we're seeing here is there are huge swathes of the American population who are just not being supported at all. We've got a lot of homelessness coming about because of the crisis. But also, I read something about the prison system and actually how a huge amount of prisons in America have become kind of hotbeds for the virus, and nothing has been done about it. And these people are still human beings, whether they've committed crimes or not, and they're not being adequately looked after. So I love the way this article ended, and I just wanted you to reflect on it as I read it. It says, the remotes among us should be concerned, and not just because of the unfairness of the COVID-19 class divide. If the essentials aren't sufficiently protected, the unpaid are forced back to work earlier than is safe. And if the forgotten remain forgotten, no one is secure. COVID-19 will continue to spread sickness and death for months, if not years to come. So it's all sounding a little bit bleak at the minute, but I wanted you to have the facts about inequality before we move on to the positives and the plan for the future. Now, many of you will have come across the Black Lives Matter movement recently in the news following the George Floyd case, where a police officer rested his knee on the neck of a young black man and suffocated him to death. And so much has happened off the back of this single event. There's much more in the media about police brutality, about how black communities, as black males, young black males, are often a group of people who are being targeted by the police, and the unfairness in the system with that. And this is something that I really want to kind of develop a bit of student voice on in our school. So we'd really like to get a bit of a focus group going to discuss these issues. There just isn't enough time in one gathering. If you're interested in becoming part of a focus group and discussing the Black Lives Matter movement in our local community, you know, if you attended protests, have you got opinions on the statues that have been pulled down? Have you got an opinion on you know, the pandemic and protests and whether they should go ahead or not? If you have, we need you to form part of this focus group. And initially, I'd just like you to email me, Mrs. Fox, initially, and we can set something up. But this article from the New York Times I thought was fascinating because it actually dovetails the two crises, the police brutality, black community crisis, and the coronavirus crisis, and it started to call it a pandemic within a pandemic. So it explores this idea of civil unrest and the fact that the coronavirus crisis has actually exposed, it's unearthed, it's showing the world how much certain races are losing out in society and they're just not being looked after. And this is why we've got more deaths in the black community, not because genetically you know, that there's something that means they're more susceptible to the virus. It's because societies are not built to protect these communities. So it talks about Black Americans are bearing the brunt of three crises: police violence, crushing unemployment, and the deadliest infectious disease threat in a century. And the fact that these crises are completely interrelated for all the reasons I've just said. So, you know, when we think about the Black Lives Matter movement, that's kind of experienced a bit of a resurge recently. It doesn't exist in isolation. The Black Lives Matter movement has gained so much more momentum because of the coronavirus crisis that has exposed all of these inequalities, and that contributes to the civil unrest that we're seeing in the USA and the UK. So which problems then need to be solved? Well, we know that the deaths from coronavirus disproportionately affect the black community. We need to be putting things in place, protesting, thinking about why that is the case. Why does our society not cater medically, politically, you know, economically? Why does our society not cater for these groups of people the way it should? Police brutality clearly is affecting the black community more than others, and political systems aren't representative of people with people of colour who also suffer much higher unemployment rates. I'd really like to call for action, you know, and get people political, get people interested in fighting for this cause, because you know, it's something that's really disturbing a lot of people, just seeing this inequality play out on such a large scale. But I do want to twist the narrative a little bit before we finish, and I want to look at schools and education. What I would hate is for you to take all of this feeling, these feelings of unrest, all of these feelings of possible panic, you know, society's crumbling, what do we do? I don't want you to think of it that way, because in moments of crisis, actually, what we end up finding is we see a lot more humanity. And there's a really good book out at the minute called Humankind by Rutger Bregman, and that is what it's about. It's about how in moments of war, in moments of you know, international tragedy, community tragedy. What we actually see is people coming together, and we see people actually becoming much more efficient, effective, hopeful. We see more progress. You'll have studied in history, for example, that during the world wars, this is where we see a lot of medical and technological change happen for the better. So I wanted to share with you this little anecdote, that after the New Zealand earthquake in Christchurch, which you've probably seen on the news, in 2011, it was an absolutely devastating earthquake, and whole schools were kind of dismantled because of the earthquake. But a lot of people were saying, well, we need special dispensation for the exams. But actually the experts were saying, no, we don't need special dispensation. You haven't lost out. Instead, what actually happened, and we have the benefit of hindsight here, what actually happened, as you can see here, the performance of Christchurch students went up. During the crisis, the Christchurch crisis, the earthquake crisis, when students were being taught from home, just like you are now, their grades went up. Why? Your teachers were tailoring the learning more to what students couldn't do. They were reacting, they were responding, they were thinking about what the students needed, and everything was tailored to address these problems and these gaps. People were coming together in a moment of crisis. And I want to reassure you that that is what you're going to experience in your school life now. Your teachers have got you. They know how to help you. They know how to intervene. And you are not a victim of the coronavirus crisis. And I want you to kind of think about these three ideas, really. I've got 3 quotes for you, and I'm not going to form your opinion for you. I'd like you to take this away and think about it. The pandemic has exposed the violence of social inequality. And it's when crisis hits, when the bombs fall or the floodwaters rise, that we humans become our best selves. So be thinking, how can you become your best self right now? And lastly, this is a once in a century opportunity to reorientate society. Now, reorientating society can happen on a small scale. What can you do for your community? Can you help in the Black Lives Matter movement? Can you help with the gender problem? Can you help in any way, shape or form, at home, at school? If there's something you can do to reorientate society, make a change for the better, now is the time. Thank you.